Good afternoon, and welcome to lecture number 4 of the School of Architecture and Planning Spring Lecture Series. It is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Jescelle Major. Jescelle spoke to my professional practice class 3 weeks ago, so we had the good fortune to get a sneak peek at her expertise and process. Jescelle comes to us today from Seattle, where she is an associate in an interdisciplinary firm leading in community engagement and qualitative analysis. She's also the founder of Well Outside Strategy and Thought Lab. Jescelle holds a degree in sustainability and the built environment from the University of Florida and a Master of Landscape Architecture from Louisiana State University. She's also a graduate of the Cushman School, as well as Design and Architecture Senior High, each integral to her practice. Her research in current professional design centers on urban scale change, driven by environmentalism, historic fabric, and social justice. Jescelle worked alongside teams within City of Miami Beach Parks and Recreation and the design firm Methuen. She has consulted with well-known landscape architecture firms such as Michael van Valkenburg Associates to aid in bringing greater inclusivity to their design process. She was an appointee on the Seattle Design Commission, as well as a later term on the Seattle Arts Commission, and co-chaired the Public Art Advisory Committee, where she still serves as a member. Jescelle is on the board of directors for Sawhorse Revolution and the Shape Our Water design team for Seattle Public Utilities. With that, I will turn it over to Jescelle. Welcome to Morgan State.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I am those things sometimes, and then sometimes I'm a mess. I think you're getting the best version of me today, though, so that's great news. I am going to share some slides with you. I have built them around a central theme, which you'll sort of start to see, but it also moves you through different parts of my biography or chronology. So feel free to ask any sort of questions that are either about me or my journey and my professional work, or some of the projects and things that I will allude to in my slides. So with that, I'll start sharing. And so I've titled this piece today, My Hands Will Carry Me, and the many reasons I hope yours will join in and help. And part of this title is just sort of not knowing what I wanted to talk about yet. And part of it is sort of thinking about coming back to ideas and things that I have sort of put out into the atmosphere before, and maybe we're not finished or are still resonant. So I actually wrote a piece for Sawhorse Revolution's blog, and it was titled, And My Hands Will Carry Me, and you'll sort of see what that starts to mean. But I thought it was a really good topic to sort of bring back up at this current moment, especially in the broad way that I've started to define hands. And so that's anything from your craft and making to your literal fingerprint and own identity to a helping hand, a community hand, a hand in activism. So any of those things are sort of can be replaced for hands. And so these are just some titles from articles from Scientific American. And I usually like to start an article or a piece that I'm writing, or even a lecture such as this, with a quote or some data. And I usually lean on different types of journals and scholarly publications and research that is outside of landscape architecture, and then bring it back to our practice. And I think that that's because sometimes people are unsure what we do, and they're looking for data or numbers or metrics, and are less understanding of some of the more theoretical things that we bring to the table. So I always start there and then show how these really cool explorations in design and making circle back to these general topics. And I've made this Why Are Scientists So Averse to Public Engagement the largest, because I think if you quickly swap out scientists for landscape architects or clients or developers, it's a question that all of us are facing in our own work. And it's something that's still equally important, even when there is opposition or trepidation around public engagement. And you'll see much of my talk is sort of centered around that. And these themes come back in many different ways. And so in the spirit of Scientific American and data, I'll start with a few numbers. So this one, 800,000, what does that refer to? Well, just for example, that is the number of people estimated to have been involved in building the Great Wall of China. That involves soldiers, common people, even sort of servant labor. And just that number itself is a bit staggering, and it's important that in sort of titling this, I talked about my hands, but I also asked you to join in, and this shows that in order to build sort of significant things, whether that's physically or metaphorically, it takes numbers of us to do so. 2.3 million. That's the number of stones estimated to make up the Great Pyramid at Giza. It's a huge number, and so when we're building retaining walls, it won't quite be 2.3 million stones likely, and each of them probably won't weigh a ton or more, but it's this idea that all of these little pieces, or in this case, large pieces, come together to create and erect something that's truly powerful and long lasting, the sort of oldest of the standing seven wonders of the world, were all of these disparate pieces that came together to stand tall. And 3%, a sad and staggeringly low number. This is the percentage of Black landscape architects as estimated by the ASLA currently. And just of note, the African Americans, as they've used the term, make up about 14% of the US population. So that 3% is really below the bar, and only 1% of those are actual ASLA members. And you see a similar trend, though not quite as stark, for Latinx population, who make up 18% of the population, but 4% of landscape architects. I'm sure numbers like this float around in a program such as yours at HBCU, but it's worth bringing this sort of injustice back up. And one, so I'll take a minute to sort of introduce myself, mostly as a compliment to what Sarah's already told you, and it's very clear now why one of me is not enough to make all of the changes that we need to make. I can never lift 2.3 million stones or make up for an 800,000 coalition of people to build a wall. And so I really love cheesy metaphors, and so you'll forgive me for that, I hope, as well as this terrible Google Slides template that I'm using. But the come up, so where did I sort of come from? What was the beginning? What was my egg stage? Sarah mentioned that I went to the Cushman School and also designed an architecture senior high, the logos which you see on the right. And I was really fortunate that both of those places really nourished creativity and arts and even design thinking and systems thinking. And so I didn't have to discover design thinking when it was time to go to college or even to pick a career, which is pretty fortunate and maybe rare. I realize that. But I do want to give credit to the exploration I was allowed to do, especially at Design and Architecture Senior High. There I was an architecture student, which is something that's unique to magnet programs. You kind of get to specialize. And so I was already taking college coursework in architecture. And I thought,
Thank you for Colleen, is that something on our end or is that at Jescelle's end?
I think it's at Giselle's end. I was just about to type into the chat to see if it was freezing, if the screens were freezing for everybody else. We'll just give her
yep, freezing for us too. Me too.
Okay. We'll just give her a few minutes and see if she's able to jump back on. It seems like it's probably just a connection problem. There she is.
okay, I'm gonna go back a slide because maybe there was a part of that that got chopped.
Yeah, I think you were on the egg slide when everything cut out.
Okay. Pros and cons of all of this technology going on. Okay. So at Design and Architecture Senior High, I was an architecture student, and I thought that that's what I wanted to do when I grew up. That's what I applied for college. And then I arrived at the University of Florida. There I was an architecture student for about a semester before I realized it wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be. And I wanted to find something that was still in the built environments, that was really dealing with urbanism and design thought. And at that time, they created a sustainability program, and that ended up being a great fit. It also, by the time I was graduating, people were sort of still confused. What is sustainability? What skills do you have? And how is that a job? And now I think everybody knows and uses the term widely, but it wasn't the case then. And so I decided I would get a professional degree. And I thought about all of the design disciplines, and I eventually decided on landscape architecture at LSU. It was the only landscape architecture program I actually applied for. And I thought exploring and learning landscape in Louisiana would be a great tool. Also at the bottom here, I have logos from the Bath Museum, City of Miami Beach, Denver Zoo. These are all jobs and internships that I had while I was in school, grad and undergrad. And it was really important for me to explore what the public sector was doing, what nonprofits were doing, what other creatives were doing, because my school had a ton of resources for traditional design firms. And so I decided to supplement that with a different perspective. So when it was time to graduate, I knew what kind of work I wanted to move into. So enter the race. We started with this really fun egg who turned into this really cute hatchling. And then maybe I was in this point where I decided, am I just an egg in the pan? Like, did I skip the really cute chick phase? And so I started my professional career at Methuen here in Seattle. It's an interdisciplinary firm with landscape architects, interior architects, urban designers, and more. And I was on the landscape architecture team there, working on projects anywhere from site scale to private developments to K-12 projects, higher education projects, tech campuses, a huge breadth. And I got to be pretty involved in the projects from day one, which was, I think, kind of exciting and fortunate, and I'm really grateful for that. But I started to realize that the things that I was best at and most passionate about, and why I got into landscape architecture, was to sort of relate to people, and I wasn't doing a ton of that. So I started looking for a role that sort of made it very clear that this is about community, whether that's community building, community activism, or advocacy. And so I found myself doing a community outreach and engagement role, or taking rather, at Burke Consulting. It's a strategy and policy and planning firm. I work across all of those, which is maybe not something I would have originally thought I was going to do with a landscape architecture degree, but it's so helpful for all of that. So whether I'm doing a parks and open space plan, or whether I'm writing a strategic plan for a fire department or a nonprofit, the sort of systems thinking, the ability to design and to use craft are really important to my work there. But I think that there was a bit of a gap. And with that entered activism. And so I think I was looking for ways that my job would do everything. And I realized that if I really wanted to be a part of community and thinking about what I could be offering to community, I needed to get active. And so I've sort of called out that sort of the root of the word there. And I chose this definition because direct, vigorous action really spoke to me. So in a year full of activism, protest, riot, everything in between, I wanted to find something that made sense for me. And I've always been comfortable with direct, vigorous action, something that's pursuant of a specific goal or idea, and something that I could track over time. And I really wanted to think about how can my design skills, how can my interpersonal skills and professional work lead me in activism. And so here's a photo of me at a build for Sawhorse Revolution, the organization which I wrote this initial article for, building what would be the first deck for a tiny home here in Seattle to deal with our housing crisis. Fitting that in the activism section, I'm wearing a No Dapple t-shirt. And here I am with volunteers like myself, other contractors, and members of the organization working away. I found out about the organization from a previous coworker, and from there I spent a lot of time outside of work thinking and dreaming up with students ways that your hands could really make an impact on the whole community, and have sort of found my way to the board and continue to be a part of Sawhorse. And so I have pulled a little snip from that original article. I thought about rewriting it or summarizing it, and then I thought I meant what I said when I wrote it the first time. And so please forgive me for reading off of a slide. I know that's not ideal, but I think I said it the way that I really meant it the first time. And so I'll just read the introduction from that for you. Like I said, I usually like to start with a quote. I don't know if you've ever watched Finding Forrester, but it's sort of that idea that you use somebody else's words and then you find your own. And Bob Goff is a preacher and an educator. And I use this quote from him that says, "Something happens when you feel ownership. You no longer act like a spectator or consumer because you're an owner. Faith is at its best when it's that way too. It's best lived when it's owned." And for me, that's how I think about community engagement and community outreach, and even just practice as a landscape architect. It's providing ownership. So whether that's for yourself to feel really proud of the drawings and the construction set that you've made, of the decisions and opportunities that you've conducted throughout the process, or if it's the ownership that you're allowing your client or the inhabitants to take and be proud of what you've created for them. I think having ownership is a really great tool towards sustainability and longevity, which I think go hand in hand. You want something to last a long time if you've done it well. And so from that quote, I sort of led into this introduction to say, having a broad skill set, a deep sense of self, and a willingness to confront adversity is a type of ownership. It's an ownership of body, mind, and spirit. This ownership gives us the ability to engage with things we don't know or fully understand because of the faith we have in what we do know and have learned. Our hands can lead us to this wisdom, especially when engaged early and often. The story of one's hands is at once one of reliability and uncertainty. More, it is one of whimsy and of pragmatism. It is no wonder hands hold our individual and unique fingerprints. No wonder we use them to hold each other up and express unity or power. The symbolism abounds. The use of the word hands herein is as much about anatomy as it is the analog or practical ability and skill set for building, making, and realizing. And so I pulled this quote for myself, mostly because I think this is what you're working on as students or as practitioners. It's really thinking about what are your skills, how do you create this feeling of ownership in your body and in your mind, or allow others to do that, those who are part of your process or who experience your project. And it's really about diving into this practical ability that you are developing as a student and the skill set you are for making and realizing. And so I think from day to day in studio with deadlines popping up, it's really easy to forget what the skill set is that you have and this really strong ability to make and realize things are. And so just reminding yourself of that and having faith and ownership in what you are bringing, I think is really important and critical to any sort of activism work. And so this is a slide from Sawhorse Revolution, again, with the numbers similar to the Scientific American data that I brought up from the beginning. Sawhorse uses carpentry, so building, actual physical making, to teach youth leadership skills and community building skills, and just similar staggering numbers to landscape architecture. It's 80% white and 99% male. Sawhorse is sort of flipping that on its head, really taking ownership of that idea that I was talking about. And we are 83% youth of color and over half are young women. So I think when you really sort of let others take ownership in a process, you start to see the numbers change and the story change and your effect and ultimately their ownership shift as well. And this is a photo from one of the most recent projects from Sawhorse Revolution. It's one of the first permitted projects from the organization. This one is a student design, and it's also student and volunteer and staff built. It's also, I think you'll see a generous embracing of what is accessible and universal design. And how this ties into activism is, one, the ownership that this community is now able to have over this building. This is Estelita's library, but also the students who have seen their design be permitted in a city and built. This project, something that's really unique about Estelita's library is that they actually house the largest collection of Black Panther papers outside of California. So it's a really interesting destination and something that students, I think, are really proud to take ownership in. And pulling from that same article I wrote, I also said that investing in craft isn't just investing in a skill, it is investing in wellness and preparedness. With this comes the realization that sharing knowledge of building and making early on to diverse groups of varying genders, races, socioeconomic classes, etc., not only builds the resulting structures, but builds up a people. Participating in programs like those hosted by Sawhorse Revolution is a way to encourage skill building, team building, and ultimately confidence building. And I think that's really clear in the story of the numbers and how you saw those shifts, and in the realization of the final library building. And of course, this article was written for Sawhorse, but I think you could easily switch this out to say Morgan State or a firm name or a client name. And it's still, thinking about investing in your skills and what you know and your overall wellness and preparedness allows you to continue to build your skills, your team, and your own confidence, which I think relays downstream from there. And then, like us on this virtual screen, here is sometimes what Sawhorse looks like these days, but students are still thinking about their hands and craft even on disparate virtual screens throughout the city. And I moved from activism to advocacy, and this one is less action-based and it's more of a supporting role. And this is something that I think we should get comfortable with. Sometimes advocacy centers us or centers something very clear or singular, and advocacy means that you need to step back and support what somebody else is doing. And so I think this is equally important as activism and worth calling some attention to. So you could be supporting a cause or a proposal. And sometimes this is the action that's more clear to us in landscape architecture when you think about what can my project work really do for a community, or how could it really be pushing forward a movement? And it's, I think, supporting somebody's cause or proposal or just sort of surfacing their needs and concerns is an act of advocacy as well. And so back to this egg in the pan, this race. I worked at Methuen, I'm currently at Burke, and then I founded my own company, Well Outside, to sort of start to think about how I could professionally be thinking about activism and advocacy alongside other firms and other clients. And because of that, I had a realization I wasn't the egg. I was back to this cute hatchling, which was great news. I don't even like eggs. And I sort of started to mature into this young hen you see strutting across the screen here. And I started, as part of this realization phase, thinking about some questions. I always ask questions of myself, and then my advocacy is the answer to those. So I was asking what advocacy and activism needed to look like for myself. I wanted to know what skills that I have from school, from all of my project work, from all of my volunteerism that I could be putting to use for the greater good. What do I know, and how can I make that a tool for change? I also have this thing that I've been saying lately, and I think it's true, that charity is so cool and goodwill is great. And if that were enough to solve all of our problems, we would have done it already. And so because of that, I asked the question and have subtitled my talk, asking and sort of putting out a call to action for other people to help enter in the squad. So I think this is something we could all be thinking about, activism and advocacy together. We could do a lot if we do it together. Like, what did those 800,000 manage to accomplish? Or what if the 3% moved to 14% and became representative? What could we do then? And so who is we? I think it's everyone. It's all of us on this call. It's all of us in landscape architecture, but it's bigger than that. I think the problems, the scale of the problems suggest that we should be working with collaborators more often, thinking about everyone we come in contact with, recognizing the intuition and knowledge of your communities and bringing them into the we as well, thinking about when your professionalism and where their institutional knowledge should come into balance. And then I asked this question, why does it need to be a mix? It's clear that having a more representative or diverse group of people at the table allows for the results to be more diverse and more accommodating. And that's, I think, essential. And always ask this question, what can you bring? What is it that you have? What is it that you are confident in? What is something that you have questions about? And can you bring those into your advocacy work? And so here's a last snip, I think. I will confirm as we click through from that article. And it says, building across the ages allows us to fail and persevere. In essence, perseverance is a muscle. And through trial, error, and repetition, a muscle memory can be developed to help us continue on throughout the challenges life most certainly will bring. Building becomes a conversation. We tell the materials and tools what we want to make, and they speak back about what we should do. Learning from their nature teaches us in ways true only to the building process. The connection and dialogue also allows us to optimize for a more sustainable and pointed practice towards resilient buildings and sites. Through building, we also afford ourselves the opportunities to see a drawing or dream or image brought to life. We get to see the 2D become 3D and a space become a more comfortable, common, familiar place. This reinforcement and materialization of thoughts is an important reminder in grade school, in high school, and college, and most certainly as we begin shaping our lives. It's also important as we develop into professionals. We will often need to remind ourselves that a forest only grows because it has roots. So this conversation piece, I think, is really important. This dialogue with the thing that you're making, sometimes an inanimate dialogue, or the dialogue with those that you are making with, and sort of reminding yourself what you are rooted in and grounded in allows you to persevere after any sort of failure and continue to move through challenges. And so it's clear that dialogue is the thing that might come to our rescue. And I think it's a question sometimes, is talking design? And I think it is. So here are just a list of projects from my work on the Design Commission, and you can start to see that if we are talking about and thinking critically about all of this work, how that could really rapidly or even incrementally affect the city through design. And so this dialogue does become action, it does become activism, and it does become advocacy. This is an image that a coworker sent to me, and it's from a project of mine that I was a part of as through my role in the Seattle Arts Commission and the Public Art Advisory Committee. So we talk a lot about what art is coming into the city and how we can be innovative. Here's a Yardside campaign that went out during the pandemic, and it was a way to meet people out in the landscapes where they were safe, to still bring some joy. And you can start to see like how thinking about the artist's hands, that individual artists, poets, writers, photographers, filmmakers submitted their pieces for these signs that were just scattered throughout the city that you found in serendipity, but using using your skills and thinking about place really impactfully allows someone downstream, like this young child, to start thinking about how they might use their own. And as Sarah mentioned, I've been doing some of this work through Well Outside, thinking about activism as a professional outlet. And so I've done some equity coaching, not a title I've given myself, but when somebody said, that's maybe what you're doing, I think it fits. So I've worked with NVVA on their Black Lives Matter framework. And as a design firm, I think that's very clearly an example of dialogue being a design exercise. I also serve on the SPU, or Seattle Public Utilities design team. And so that's a lot of talking, but in uncovering histories and stories unique to Seattle, we've been able to think about how we might reimagine our infrastructure for the next 50 years. Seattle is currently a combined overflow system, which clearly needs to change for environmental reasons. And so facilitating these conversations, designing what the questions are going to be, the format's going to be, how we're going out into the public and asking questions is very much a design exercise with design implications. And then I've also started, I'm calling this piece Musings, and it's this idea that sometimes it's a conversation where you're asking questions or putting things out, and it's not necessarily waiting on a reply back. So I did this interview for the Landscape Architecture Foundation, and again, I've just pulled some quotes from that. I think what I wrote in this piece is still applicable, and it didn't sort of make sense to rephrase. And I'll share the link. You could read them more broadly. I won't read them out to you, but I think each of these are really critical steps. So if there's a simple solution, choose that one. I think that's advice that I would take into studio. I would take with you into practice. And I think simple, be careful with that. It doesn't mean the easy one. It doesn't mean that it's the cheapest one. It means that it's the one that's most clear and directly responsive to your goals and situation. If there's nobody to look up to, look inward. It's you. That one's really important. I think it's really easy to get self-conscious or to doubt some of your own abilities and skills, and you're looking all around you for somebody to look up to. And if you're someone like me who is a Black female in landscape architecture, good luck finding somebody to look up to. You have to look inward and find what you and rely on what you know. And so instead of waiting on a what if or, oh, someone should really do this, you can do it yourself, or at least ask others to join in. Always think about your safety, and I mean that very broadly, your well-being, your health, what you can, protecting yourself in any space allows you to protect what you're creating. And I think it's also really important to document everything. If it's something that's your idea, take the credit for it. If it's something that isn't, encourage that person to take the credit for it, and also spread the word. Like it's so important to continue to share good works and to use that as inspiration, or to give credit when it's due, or to show people that a certain thing can be done and encourage them to do that for themselves. And the last one, curate and critique. That's something that you should be familiar with from studio, but it's also something that I think you should carry with you into your professional practice. Or maybe it's something that you do in your day-to-day, really being careful about how you're curating a space or a city or a program, and how you're critical of what you're doing, what others are doing, and using those as tools for your activism and advocacy. And so building communities, I think, is also a really important dialogue. And here's just a snip from a project, just to say that sometimes it's conversation and other times it's something that's familiar to your process. I'm sure you've all seen these context maps and site visits. And here we are in Georgetown, Seattle, looking at a site for what would become a tiny home village to house families and individuals who are experiencing homelessness. And so from this site tour came our hands doing a quick sketch, which became a real place. And so you can use these conversations and what you're hearing from others to actually build and implement something. And that's what's so unique about being in landscape architecture and being in a design field. And then sometimes building communities looks like this blurry photo, and this was for a parks plan, asking the community, what are you really excited about? Of course, this was in person when we could do things like go to middle school, which is what this is from. But we've also found ways to do similar things online. I'm sure you're all versed in Mural at this point. And we did this with city staff actually to get them thinking in similar ways about what they want from their parks and trails system. And maybe not as tactile as real Post-it notes, but these digital ones also allow us to get into really important dialogue. And then sometimes you build community in ways that you don't always think about. So for me, the strategic plan is a great example of that. I didn't think that I would be doing that, but thinking about the urban realm and nonprofit work and creating a plan for them to best do their work is also a way to advocate for or start building community. And these are just some logos that I designed from some ongoing projects. And I think that giving voice to a place and giving identity to a project is also a great way to start building communities and giving people things to latch onto and brand their efforts with. And then, of course, a little Justin Bieber. I won't play the whole thing, but he basically says you don't have to make your mind up right now. And so maybe I wasn't that chick, maybe I was a gator hatchling, who knows, I don't know. I think I don't, this moral is I don't have to quite decide. And I sort of want to end here. We've talked about activism and advocacy, and I want to end with adventure. And I think that you don't have to lose that. Like, you don't have to lose the joy of designing in order to do those other things. And maybe you have to seek it through your projects, or maybe you need to seek it and build it yourself, like I did with Well Outside. But I really love this definition of undertaking, you know, and thinking about something that's exciting or remarkable. And so this is just a snip from a kayak that I built here in Seattle to say that sometimes you build things that are really detailed and personal, and maybe it's not a whole system. And other times, maybe you, as part of your adventure, you pretend you know something. Like, here's me pretending I know about plants. I don't. But because I decided that it was part of my adventure to work with others who were really passionate about that, I got to flex my skills at making place and making things feel really welcoming alongside a coworker of mine who is really great at plants. And so pretending sometimes leads you to your solution. So here are some Sawhorse students. They don't necessarily know how it is to be a great designer yet, but they are able to sort of convince themselves to step into that role. And here they are talking to somebody experiencing homelessness. And then you sort of see at the end what comes from those villages and that process that they went through. Or maybe they don't know how to do everything with tools yet, but if they sort of step into or pretend to be their future themselves, they're willing to and able to be receptive and learn new tips, tricks, tools to be leaders. I've zoomed past that. And so that photo of me with a homeowner and a colleague sketching turned into this place. And you can see that maybe I was pretending in the beginning, but it has become a realized and real place. This is blockhouse number 3. It now houses somebody who was previously unhoused on private property. And you can see that with all of us carrying these rocks and stamping gravel down and protecting trees, we were able to create something really dignified and beautiful. And then sometimes I still just draw random things, create articles, think about getting into spaces that aren't always landscape based. And so these are some drawings from this weekend that I did with some friends for a Perfume Magazine, actually. So sometimes the adventure and your design skills can be applied to things that aren't necessarily a major social justice movement or big design decisions. And so with that, I'd love for us to move from my ideas about activism and advocacy and adventure to thinking about us and the idea that all of our hands can really make a difference. And so I'd love to stop there and take questions or just get into conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Jescelle. That was wonderful. I'm sure there are questions out there or comments, or so feel free to just unmute yourselves or put it in the chat. I mean, I'll just say really quickly that I love the idea of hands having multiple meanings, from fingerprints to carrying something to drawing. I remember a couple years ago I broke my right wrist, and it's like, this is what I use this is my tool for my business, you know. And so it became really clear to me that, you know, it's a very important part of our physical body. But I also love the idea of dialogue equaling design, and I think that's something we talk about. I know I talk to my students a lot about, you know, graphics are our tool of communication in landscape architecture, and but I think that dialogue, the idea of conversation, it does generate design, and you can't design in a vacuum, and you shouldn't design in a vacuum, particularly when it comes to community. And I think that's something that it resonated with me, and I'm curious to see or to know how do you approach most projects that way, like, you know, just opening up conversation with your clients, or do they approach you first? I know you said that you approached Michael Van Valkenburg's office because you knew that they were having issues, which I think is so bold.
Yeah, I did approach them, but I think it has worked both ways now at this point. Sometimes people come to me and want to have a dialogue, and other times I invite other people to sort of talk about things. And usually I'll look for ways that people are already moving in a space. So I don't usually come to somebody with something they're not thinking about or something that isn't integral to their practice or process, but I've sort of presented it back to them as why I think something that they're working on is actually a part of something that is bigger or broader or more embedded in the profession. And presenting it back that way, I think, gets people talking. They realize, like, oh, I am a part of this, or I have been thinking about this, here's what I can offer. And so I think in that phase, the design is less about the physical thing, and it's designing a process and designing questions and thinking about strategically what you want to ask people or allow them to talk about, to then get people sort of going. And then once you do that, people are really, they have a lot to say or offer or questions of their own. And so I think just leading in that way, I use that word pretend, and there's maybe another word that gets to that, but it's sort of stepping into something and then encouraging others to step into it too, even if you aren't fully confident that you know everything about it. But I think that let me sort of step to Michael Van Valkenburg's office in that way. Like, I just sort of saw where I thought maybe they could be going and shared how I thought they might already be thinking about it. And then they were able to step into that with me.
I think you're also then introducing, as you said, a little bit of ownership, right? So it's like, as soon as people feel in kind of like they've got some manner of entitlement or ownership, you're right, they feel more comfortable, and it's not someone kind of forcing something on them.
I have a question. It's a little more specific.
Sure.
Well, first, I just want to say I've been looking forward to your presentation like all semester. I go to every single one of these, and yours was like the one I was most looking forward to, and I was not disappointed. So
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Yes. So my question is, I wanted to know what you learned through the process of with the design dialogue and lessons learned and things regarding the tiny home village. And also I think you showed an accessory dwelling unit too on a private property. But anyway, as someone who is really into advocacy and activism for ending homelessness, I just wanted to know a little bit more about that.
Sure. So each one had a bit of a different process. So the village is on city-owned property. And it's sort of an emergency use condition because we are in a state of emergency as it relates to homelessness in Seattle. So we were able to get away with a few things that wouldn't necessarily be traditionally supported by code because of the emergency use. But it was a partnership with independent builders and contractors who made the homes, volunteers who made the homes, architecture firms who wanted to be a part of that. And it came together with the city of Seattle. The Low Income Housing Institute was sort of like the facilitator of all of those things. And that village was actually an example of a coworker of mine thinking about ownership and coming to somebody with a proposal. He had been to some of the other tiny house villages and they hadn't really been planned. It was, and people were sort of celebrating the fact that at least there was land that had homes on it. And we wanted to think about what happens if you actually design what that layout is like, and think about community as central to that interview community. People who would potentially be residents there and really thinking about layout. So it was still really simple and low tech just because of the nature of the village. But it was much more considered and dignified of a process. And I think there usually is an access to design that they wouldn't normally get. So Mithun was really generous to allow us to do that design work pro bono. And so that program also was in partnership with Nicholsville. So there were certain rules that tenants had to agree to live in that community. And it was also meant to be transitional. So you don't build your whole life there, but you get yourself sort of back on track instead of a lot of camp tents kind of situations that we have throughout the city. This is more of a considered and designed solution. It isn't, however, scalable enough to accommodate everybody. So it can't be the only solution. And we can't just say like, let's have more land to put tiny homes on. Doesn't quite get at the density or the sort of root causes to homelessness, both of which need to be moving in conjunction. But it was sort of an exercise of thinking about how you could, with really limited resources, build a place in a community that was really sort of pushing design to help humanity, I guess. And then the other project, the ADU project, that's through an organization called the Block Project, and different homeowners with space on their individual lots actually apply to host a home, and it's still permitted, and those are much more high design homes. They're meant to be longer term for residents, and also there's a different vetting process since they will essentially be sharing property with the homeowner. And that project was also pro bono design. We also got lots of the materials donated, and it was all installed with volunteers like myself. So that process is a little bit different, but it's still working on the same issue and thinking about advocacy in a different way. And some people, maybe they are like, well, I actually just have extra space, and that's the thing I can offer to the site. And that's what they've done with that home. So there's lots of different models here and lots of design that's needed. It isn't always at the forefront in what people are thinking about. They're just thinking about getting people in a house, and they aren't always thinking about how the design can make that more resilient or comfortable or dignified. And that's sort of where you would need to advocate for that on behalf of others, and show why that's actually valuable and value added to the product and not just prettying something up.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Others?
If you're like me and don't think of a question live in the moment, I always have to go away and then the question or comment pops in my head. You could feel free to contact me. I know that you've had some other lecturers who are really sort of like in Starchitects at this point and maybe feel less accessible, but I'm open, and I'm maybe a little bit closer to having graduated than some other lecturers. So I sort of see I'm not so far removed from school, but I've been in practice long enough to sort of give tips or answer questions about either of those. So I'm happy to do that.
I just have a quick question about Mural. You talked about that. Is that
Sure.
it's a digital post-it notes for community design, community discussion? I've never heard of it before.
Oh yeah, it's a digital platform that built around collaboration in real time. So you can give access to certain people to allow them to participate live, or you can sort of be the driver and populate things on your own. And it's pretty broad what you're able to do. So we've used it as sort of the one-to-one for the Post-it notes, but a lot of teams use them internally. I've seen studios doing their final reviews that way, so they could send the link out to their final boards to jurors, and then everybody's able to zoom in on things as they want to a little bit more comfortably than you would be able to do in, say, like just a PowerPoint. And then it allows lots of comment features. So we use the Post-it notes, but there's also, you can type directly into space, you can mark things up, annotate. So it could be very freeform, or it could be more programmed. So because we were doing that with a city client, and we wanted to move them through a series of activities that were place-based, we developed a series of maps and allowed them to give feedback spatially, so directly in relationship to one of the districts or ideas. So it was formed that way, but it's pretty open what you can do with Mural. There are limitations to the free version. So there is something to think about there. Like, I think the number of projects you're allowed to have open and how many people can access or manipulate on the free version is different than the paid, but it is a really powerful tool. And I've seen it used in public meetings, in internal meetings, kind of like the one that I used. I've seen it just be left open for public comment. So there's, I think, lots of use. Yeah. They might have the link up. I know I just went to some recent reviews for Ohio State, and their studios are presenting off of Mural.
Oh, all right, cool.
I just wanted to say thank you so much. It was a really inspiring talk, and your work is really inspiring.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you. It was great.
And I'm going to keep you on our roster for reviews, et cetera, because even when we're post-COVID, it'll be fun to have you zoom in.
Great. I love that.
So yeah, if any of you have questions, you can always email me and I can send you the link to, or Jescelle's email if she. So,
yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, great. Well, anything else, then it's almost 1.